Hi there, welcome back to the Car UK channel. Today we're going to talk about diesel engines, and in particular, as mentioned in the title of this video, why is it that modern diesel engines are no longer really reliable? Well, I'm going to give you my view, working on petrol and diesel engines for the last 20 or so years, working in the garages, fixing these vehicles, dealing in MOT tests, emission standards, buying and selling these vehicles. What has changed radically over the last, say, 10 or 15 years in particular, which has made the modern diesel engine really not fit for purpose for everyone like it was maybe 20 or so years ago. When then, in my view, diesel engines were probably at their peak. Now, diesel engines have not always been that popular. In fact, really, it's only since the late 80s, early 90s that they started to grow a bit of favour. Prior to the 1980s, diesel engines were really only used in sort of heavy machinery, sort of agricultural stuff, trucks and buses, and occasionally you get them in some big cars. Maybe people would use them for taxis and stuff like that. Now, the problem with them is that they were very unrefined and the performance wasn't very good on them either. Although they were economical, in fairness, this is why maybe taxi drivers and lorry drivers obviously use them to get that extra MPG, and also very torquey. However, for car production, they just were never that popular until we got into the 1980s. And what really changed the diesel engine and brought it into its new life was the advent of turbocharging vehicles, or making it more common. Petrol engines had started being turbocharged really in the late 70s, early 80s, and that craze continued on into the late 80s and 90s, and manufacturers decided, why not turbocharge diesel engines? You can increase performance of the vehicles, actually get more miles per gallon, and actually makes them slightly more refined as well. And no better manufacturer took on that challenge to improve the diesel engine than Peugeot Citroën. Anyone who's owned one of those older vehicles, such as a Peugeot 205, 405, the 406 later on, 306, 309, also as well, the Citroëns as well, they had the big Xantias and the BX. All these were fitted with turbocharged diesel engines available, and people actually bought them in the droves. They actually started to become really popular because all of a sudden you now could get decent performance, turbocharging that nice oomph of power, low down, lots of torque, and getting really good miles per gallon. 45 miles per gallon being very easy to achieve. At a time when diesel was actually cheaper to buy at the pump than petrol as well, it made a lot of sense for people to switch from petrols to diesels. And that seemed to go on into the 1990s, as because people started to realise that these engines not only were giving all this performance and better fuel economy, they were actually really, really reliable, far reliable than their petrol counterparts. Then we started to see other manufacturers jumping on that bandwagon as more people were buying diesels. Companies like Volkswagen took it to another level in the late 90s with its pump derv engines. The 1.9 TDI unit they brought out was absolutely superb, and they kept improving it. It was a reliable engine that could pack huge amounts of power and could obtain power out bands of up to 150 to 170 brake horsepower. All of a sudden, diesel was now passing petrol equivalents and coming with great incentives as well, as the governments were now pushing people to buy diesel engines, because in their view they believed that they were actually less harmful to the environment than petrols, although they make a massive U-turn on that when they discover that actually diesels produce things such as particulates which are really harmful to the environment and to air quality. So the real peak, if you like, of diesel engines was probably around the late 90s, early 2000s, when the emissions controls hadn't really come in. There were emissions controls then, but they were very, very lax. They weren't as strict as what was to come. So diesel engines were at sort of that sweet spot where they had some emissions controls, but they still had very simplistic setups. They were reliable and could pack huge amounts of miles really without very little maintenance. So what radically changed? Well, what started to change in the 2000s as we get into the noughties as well was emissions controls getting even more stricter, as we started to introduce things like Euro 5 and Euro 6 emissions. Now, the big one came first of all in Euro 5 emission standards, which actually came into effect in 2011, but actually manufacturers were jumping on the bandwagon to comply a lot earlier than that. Most cars by sort of 2007, 2008 were now getting towards Euro 5 standards. They were getting ahead of the curve. They didn't want to leave it last minute. And the main thing Euro 5 brought in was diesel particulates, i.e. that a car had to have a DPF filter fitted to it by 2011, but the manufacturers are bringing them in early. Peugeot Citroën was one of the first ones. They were jumping on the bandwagon to get diesel particulate filters fitted to their vehicles. But within a year or so, pretty much every manufacturer out there was fitting DPS, with some odd exceptions. Now, DPF is effectively a filter which is built into the exhaust system, which sits underneath the car, sometimes on the manifold or sometimes further down. And it's basically a honeycomb, and it takes away some of the particulates that diesels produce and breaks them down over time, what's called a regeneration process. So as the car's driving, gets particularly hot, under certain driving standards, it will actually regen or effectively heat up this element and break down these particulates so it burns out of the exhaust and produces overall less emissions. Now, in theory, it's a good idea. It actually generally does reduce emissions, but there is a problem with diesel particulate filters in that they need to be driven in a certain way. You can't just use them for stop-start journeys. And what was happening at the time is that we're starting to see manufacturers not being particularly honest how DPFs work. They were just interested in selling vehicles. So lots of people were buying diesels who weren't really suited for those vehicles. They were doing too many short journeys, too many stop-starts. All the things that they'd had prior to that in the earlier diesel engines with performance, lots of decent MPG, reliability, weren't going to work or weren't going to be the same in these later vehicles, because if you're just going to use them for stop-start driving all the time, doing school runs and stuff like that, they're going to clog up. And they don't just clog up the DPF system, they can actually affect the rest of the emissions control systems. Things like EGRs can block up as well, it can even affect injectors. So around 2008 was when we started to see emissions become really unreliable. So diesels did lose a lot of reliability during that period, but it wasn't the end of the world. In reality, it just wanted a bit more education of people thinking, actually, if I'm going to buy a diesel, do I need it? Is it worth paying that extra money for a diesel? Because generally diesel engines are more expensive to buy than the petrol equivalent. Is it actually going to get that saving back in miles per gallon? If you're doing short journeys, it probably wasn't worth the while. But they still would have a purpose. And it certainly didn't affect sales, because people were still buying diesels in their droves, even going into the noughties. The diesel craze had well and truly shot off. But things were radically about to change for the worse. And what really was the final nail in the coffin for me, for modern diesels, was Euro 6 legislation. Now, Euro 6 legislation came out in about 2015, late 2015. Manufacturers were getting ready for this 2016, really, when the model years, a lot of the engines changed, a lot of manufacturers are bringing out new models. This was not coincidence. They were all trying to race to get their new engines out there, because the new legislation was so strict that most of their engines didn't comply of the old Euro 5 standard. Now, some did manage to tweak their engines to make sure they could comply, but others went back to the drawing board and completely redesigned perfectly good, reliable engines and made them even more complex to try and meet these new standards. Now, Euro 6 emission standards were extremely strict. In fact, in some cases, more than half the limits that manufacturers had to obtain in order to make sure they could sell their vehicles in Europe. But also it gave requirements that they had to have even more tech put on these vehicles. The two things that had to be done to these vehicles, one was you had to put an AdBlue system on, which is one of the major downfalls of modern cars, or the alternative, which some manufacturers went down, is they had to have a more updated advanced EGR system, exhaust gas recirculation system. Now, unfortunately, a lot of companies went down the AdBlue approach. And AdBlue, basically what it does is it's a form of liquid that injects into the diesel particulate system and turns nitrous oxide gases into effectively water. So it basically gets rid of some of the emissions. It's actually called a selective catalytic reduction system. Now, it's actually quite complex to bring in, but a lot of manufacturers decided to go down that route. It involves having to have a separate tank where you had AdBlue, you have to have an injection system into it, and of course it has to be regulated by the ECU of the car. Whereas an EGR system effectively just takes old gases and effectively throws them back into the engine in order to try and burn them up. And what it can also do as well is you can add it onto a DPF system, it can take some of those gases back out from the DPF and recirculate them back into the engine. That's a slightly more simplistic system. But the point being is at the time we've got now to 2015-16, diesel engines seem to be going through not only having to put all this emissions controls bolted onto them as mandatory to meet these new standards, but we're also at a time where manufacturers during this lot of the noughties, in my view, we're going through some period of real radical change and basically overcomplicating engines for no real reason or gain. Some manufacturers did it better than others, but some manufacturers really did just go too far with engine design, doing silly things like producing wet belts and stuff. Anyone who's had one of the later Ford engines, 2-litre diesels, the blue versions, they are terrible for wet belt failure. And that's nothing to do with emissions control, but when you're starting to complex engines anyway, and you're having to put all this new technology on these engines, which is effectively restraining the performance and making them more unreliable, it's no wonder why modern diesels are really not up to the job. They are a shadow, in my view, of the former self because there's just too much tech on them. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some decent, reliable diesels out there. Kia and Hyundai seem to do better than others in my view. Their diesels never seem to be affected as much as some of its major rivals in Europe. Mercedes as well, their 2-litre diesel and the 1.5 unit using the Renaults and stuff like that, the Dacias, they don't seem to suffer as much. But there are some manufacturers out there, in my view, just overcomplicated these engines with unreliable emissions control systems that just keep breaking and falling apart, which just does not make them fit for purpose. Give a quick example. Anyone who's owned a Citroen Peugeot unit, some of the AdBlue systems on those are always failing. The Volkswagen systems aren't that good either. A lot of those can go wrong and fail and need constant changing. Some of the DPS and the Land Rover products as well, they can fail and crack and block up the EGR system, and that causes a string of events that can happen and effectively knacker the engine up. And the reality is, as we move forward, there's going to be even more restrictions on diesel engines, whether it's local to you, whether you're not allowed to drive certain diesel engines in certain areas, or more probably legislation coming from the EU. I'm no doubt that the EU directives will probably try and throw on another a Euro 7 compliance very soon. In fact, I'm pretty sure that is on the horizon before diesels are effectively phased out in 2030, 2035, depending on which country you're in. And it's a real shame because in pure form, diesel engines, as we saw 20 odd years ago, actually do offer real, reliable engineering, really good on fuel, and can give great performance, and something you can get hundreds of thousands of miles out when designed properly, as we've seen previously. But unfortunately those days, in my view, are gone, unless somehow in the near future some type of alternative fuel comes along, or we can convert diesel engines to run on either another substance or synthetic fuels. But I think that's highly unlikely for all sorts of reasons, which I'm not going to go into in this video. So let me know your thoughts on modern diesel engines, and also as well, let me hear about some older diesels you may have owned. Which ones did you really like from years gone by? If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe and check out my other content, because I put lots of different content out on this channel about 3 or 4 times a week. So I'd love you to like and subscribe and check out my other videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you all very soon.